Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing marvelously well. I'm sitting here with my very good friend, Mr. Matthew Weiss. How are you, Matt?
I'm doing great. How you doing, Warren?
I'm good. I'm really good. You've been busier than a busy guy on National Busy Day.
Yeah, any time that I don't have work, I have this habit of like thinking of new things I can get involved in, and then all of a sudden I have all those things to do plus my work. So my latest one has been sort of a community service thing for engineers.
What exactly are you doing?
Well, there's a couple of them, but the big one that I'm really trying to start focusing on here is I want to normalize it so that mix engineers, but engineers, project engineers in general, because a lot of times it's the same engineer, get a point on the record.
Oh, that'd be amazing.
I'm glad that was your response, because I know sometimes the producers are not so into that idea and the artists are not so into that idea, and sometimes the producers and artists are really into that idea.
Oh no, I'm totally into it, because I came up as an artist and then, I produced and engineered and mixed records to build my career. But I would get hired a lot as an engineer because I would get hired by novice producers. You get a novice producer who doesn't really know how to produce a record. So they need to bring in an engineer that can also be a producer and also is a musician, also a songwriter. And that's a lot of engineers. A lot of our friends that are engineers are super talented, and they're in a room with somebody who's like, yeah, man, I dig the vibe, try it again. And they're like, yeah, second verse, I used to sit next to producers and go, yeah, the bass is a little too on top in the bridge, and then the producer would be like, yeah, are you a little on top on the bridge?
But you know what? Honestly, I give producers credit when they do that, because the producer is a leader. They're the ones who are taking responsibility for the product. And so if there's a gap in your knowledge, your whole purpose of being a producer is to make sure there's somebody in the room who fills in that gap of the knowledge.
I agree. And I say to people all the time, I worked on Frey Records as an engineer, and who wouldn't want to be on albums that sell 4 million and 2 million copies on any role? I would have assisted if necessary. So to engineer those records, even though, yes, I was going out and co-writing, I was coming up with guitar parts and drum parts and all this stuff. I don't care. I love doing all those things. The last thing you want to be in a studio is the guy or the girl that's like, well, I'm not paid to do that, so I'm not going to help out. Oh,
that's a no.
Yeah. I do not want those people in the room. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in reality, it's all, but that's the whole point of the 1 point thing, which is that the reality is music gets made, everybody does everything. Like, I've done everything. I am singing backup vocals on Akon records. All right?
Great.
So, and I love it. I love doing it. I've programmed 808s, I've made arrangement changes, and I don't feel that I'm stepping outside of my job when I do this. I feel like I'm just
you're making yourself more valuable to him.
Exactly. So my feeling is I don't know any producers who don't mix and record to some extent. I don't know any engineers who do not record and produce to some extent. I don't know any artists at this point who don't do some degree of writing, don't do some degree of engineering. Everything is very much overlapping. And so I think that's one reasoning. And then the other reasoning is because the dynamics have been steadily changing in terms of budgets and where people are living in the music world. So, like, I don't know what your COVID experiences have been. Did you find that things got a little interesting when COVID hit, like, mid-March?
At first, it was a little frustrating, because we'd had this album that we have been trying to finish for... How long have we been trying to finish this, Eric?
Close to 2 years or what?
2 to 3 years, yeah. And it'll be coming on 3 years now, but at that point, it was 2.5 years or whatever. And we've been trying to finish it. And we're so close to it. And we had the artist was coming in for 5 days, do recalls, re-sing a couple of things, tweak the mixers a little bit, out the door. Everything was going to be great. Woohoo! And then the lockdown happened, like the day before, like whatever the day was, like Friday or something. Lockdown happens. He messages and says, I'm not comfortable coming in. And we're like, we're not going to say no, but we're looking at each other like, when are we going to finish this record? It was all like, it was just one of those things. So I'm sure lots of people, that's been their experience. They had projects that they weren't able to finish. A lot of my film and TV friends have managed to stay busy, but now they're coming to a point now where, pilots haven't been filmed. There was a post today about they went back to work on a set, and then people started coming down with COVID. So everybody's a little terrified. There was a lot of work for some people for the first 2 or 3 months, but I think it's been drying up, and there's a fear about, well, where's the new work going to come from? I mean, it's going to come, but at what point?
So my experience was kind of similar, but ended up translating a little differently. I was working with I was really just starting up with a number of acts that were touring, because a lot of the guys that I work with are sort of in between the like superstar and the like just getting started, because that's kind of where I'm at in terms of my career. And it's a nice place to be, actually, in a lot of ways. But so a lot of these guys are making their money through touring.
Matt, that's where everybody who's does this for a living is at, because, especially if you're in rock, how many rock records that chart are made every year?
Fair point.
Yeah. So most rock producers that I know of, you can name every single famous producer and engineer and stuff, probably 90% of their work is either independent or on the lower $30,000 all in, as opposed to the old school $500,000 all in. So they're making it work. They're going into a Sunset Sound for 3 days rather than 6 weeks.
One of the groups, actually, that I was on deck, I'd already mixed the first single, and I was approved for the album. They wanted me for the whole thing. They had set the budget. It was a nice budget, and that was Boyz II Men. I was so pumped about that. And then they're touring.
Amazing.
It's incredible singers. And the album is really experimental. It's oh God, I cannot wait till this starts up again. But the tours got canceled. Their Vegas residency got canceled, and so immediately the whole project was like, we gotta put a stop to it. And then Akon lost like $3 million worth of touring dates, and so Akon put a halt on his projects.
This is Akon,
yeah, Akon. Sorry, if I say Con, that means Akon.
I knew you meant that, but I'm helping the
no, I got you.
Aren't as hip as you.
So all those Akon projects got halted there as well, and then there were a bunch of other projects that were supposed to come through, and they were just like, look, we're not really sure how this is going to all work out. So I lost all my business, basically, which gave me an opportunity to double down on the pro audio files. So I have some great content between like March to June that was just... I was just really, because that's what I had to do. So God bless Dan for having my back there. What I ended up doing is I ended up lowering my rates. And I didn't start re-raising my rates until last month. But in that time that I lowered my rates, I kept thinking, I was like, I've not worked this inexpensively for a long time. And on the one hand, I kind of love some of the work that I'm getting, but if I'm going to be doing this, I need to be getting back end, because this is like, it felt like I was doing myself a disservice. And then I started thinking about it more, and I was like, what about all the projects that I worked on when I was like really young and just getting started? If any of those projects had really, really taken off, I would have been paid like some of those records. I don't think I would have even been really technically compensated for, because I was working for like $20 an hour at a time. And it's like, sometimes the studio bounce was what was coming out, or, I was doing a full length mix for what would be maybe like $200 or something like that. And I think there's a lot of people who are like, they're squarely in that, I'm getting started. I've been doing this for like less than 4 years. I'm at like $200 a mix. You know what I mean?
So I have a question. So the reality is like, I don't know how many records that I have points on, that are on major labels, quite a few. And there's a couple I'll look over to the wall. James Blunt's been fantastic. Every time he puts out a record, there's a bump in sales from the album I did. You get stuff like that where the record company, they're really on it and everything. But I have albums, like the other day I was looking, and there's an artist I work with. I won't say who it is because it's not about the artist. But there's one song on the record, for instance, that has 40 million plays. And we did the math. And I made the whole album, all in, everything. Studio, me, musicians, everything for 30,000. So this is one of those all-in albums on a label. And the one song alone, even at Spotify's lowest rate, has created $157,000 worth of income. And according to the label, it has not recouped. However, the album I did afterwards, which doesn't have any songs with that many millions of plays. Remember, this is just Spotify. This is not iTunes. It's not physical sales. This is not, so... And that album hasn't sold as much, the second album, but I got a check on that one. And so half the problem is like, even with paperwork, trying to get paid is such a battle. And a lot of the time now you're probably looking at, hundreds of dollar checks, low thousands, occasional 10,000 on something really name, when you talk about actual sales. Exactly. So it's a tough one. I think it's a really good idea, but we also need to improve the business side and the infrastructure on that.
So I have a contract, and now, mind you, it's the toughest part is getting people to actually get on board with my contract. In my contract, it says that I recoup starting after expenses from the actual album production are completed, and do not include things like music video or promotion, which are separate. Yeah. And I imagine your contract is probably similar, but
it's exactly the same. Yeah, you only have to recoup, and I don't recoup. I don't recoup engineering. I just recoup the production costs. I mean, there's like, we assign a certain amount of money. If it's a $30,000 album, which is all in, there's like probably $7,500. The problem is not that. The problem is the label stopping the artist from recouping. So what they say is like, you'll get paid from record one once the artist recoups. But what they do is they make it impossible for the artist to ever recoup.
Right. So this is something that has to get changed in a all around kind of way. And there's a lot of things that need to change. One of the things that also has to be addressed is just the way things are split from streaming between like the masters and the publishing, where 88% goes to the masters, 12% goes to the songwriters. That's it. There's a lot of pushback on a lot of things. I mean, I remember when from being overseas that when somebody plays on an album, they also will get a royalty it's like a player's royalty, but we don't have that in America. And
I know.
Yeah, it's terrible though, because now you've got session musicians who are playing on humongous records and they got $500. And it's like, that record wouldn't be that big without the person who is playing those fantastic parts. It's crazy that they're not getting a royalty. There's TV channels that are trying to bully people out of their songwriting residuals and just do flat buyouts and trying to normalize that.
I mean, Netflix.
Yeah,
Netflix has completely changed the game.
I wasn't about to name names, but Discovery Channel and Netflix were the two that have been in the headlines.
I mean, we all love Netflix, but they're not paying the residuals. So I have friends that are writing for massive TV shows, but as soon as it goes on Netflix, income just disappears. I have so many mixed feelings about all of these conversations because having come up, I don't know, you must understand where I'm going with this. Having come up sort of like not knowing anybody. I have friends that are successful in music that also got successful from my age group, but there wasn't any before me. We just kind of came up, and that's been really wonderful that we're still friends and we're still doing well. But there was no like infrastructure when I was a kid. I didn't know any like really super wealthy people to help me out. I didn't work in studios. Everything I've done has been bootstrapping. So I have a mixed feeling about the old world, because the old world also perpetuated a lot of BS, a lot of really crappy sounding records. I mean, like I've said this many times, but like those late 90s through to like mid 2000s rock records are some of the worst sounding crap ever. You know what I mean? You put on a record, it's the same drum, guitar, bass, vocal sound on every single song. And the problem is now is because they had Pro Tools at an early stage. So they were like editing everything super tight, putting in the same drum samples and everything, and the most generic, awful sounding things ever. And that really destroyed our industry, but they were being rewarded enormously. They were making millions and millions of dollars from doing massively substandard work. Therein lies this sort of thing, coming up at that time in the late 90s through the 2000s, when I first started, engineering and producing. It was really depressing. You'd go and, especially in America, I'd get a band signed, and then the same, like 5 or 6 people would make the record, and it would get churned out the other side, and it was pretty awful sounding. And the band would come out feeling destroyed, like they had the life sucked out of them. And that time, it's not like the film business, where, Tim Burton, I believe, is one of the greatest directors of all time. People can argue with me. I love Tim Burton's films. But when he made Planet of the Apes and it flopped, he didn't work for years. You could be one of those big guys, and it was all guys, that made a record that cost $1.2 million. They all pocketed the money. The record came out, 4 people bought it. You still got called to make the next one at $1.2 million. it was just a weird business. You know, there was no real accountability because it was just a closed shop of like half a dozen people. So as much as I absolutely hate all of the problems we have now, I still like where we're at. That guys, I mean, look at us, guys like you and I can, you know, eke a living out of this without being one of those kind of old school first call guys that just made the record regardless.
Oh yeah, I mean it's wonderful because there is a reality that, you know, streaming has sort of leveled the playing field a little bit. So somebody like me who is not getting the lion's share of the big work by any stretch, you know, who's mostly working with small indies and independents, is still able to make a really pretty good living doing that. That's a wonderful thing. But I think that at the same time, maybe we could be doing better in some regards, and I think so. And I don't think that it doesn't just apply to me. I think it's coming from me because I have a voice in the industry. But I think that there's a lot of people, especially the guys who are like in-house engineers, where a lot of the times the studio bounce is the record that is coming out, you know, especially in the hip hop world. Like the studio, if you've been in Atlanta or Miami, you know that a lot of times there is no mix. It's just the studio bounce is what ends up playing and going to radio. And it's like this. So this person did this great work and they received no compensation after the fact. And I don't see that as being beneficial to our industry. We have come a long way, but I think that we could go a little further.
Those kind of practices always existed, though, regardless of the time now and the time then. There was always that air of, you know, I had producers taking my work and representing it as their own.
Oh yeah,
a lot.
I've had that happen. Sure.
Yeah, so I don't miss a lot of that. I think the great thing is that if you do really good work now, and somebody higher up the food chain, a record label or something, really likes it, you've got 1,000 times more chance of it actually getting put out now legitimately. Where back in the olden days, it was like there was so much money to be had. You may have produced a band and come up with the best version of that song ever, but they wouldn't care. They would still give it to one of their cronies and go, here's, you know, $500,000 as a producer to reproduce these demos. It was just, they just didn't even blink. That was just part of the quote unquote record business. The period of music I love most, you know, with the exceptions of like 60s bands and stuff, is kind of mid-late 70s to like mid-80s. There's a time of the Hugh Padgham kind of production and engineering. You know, the Peter Gabriel solo records of that period, Bowie's stuff of that period, and Off the Wall, Thriller, you know, there's so many, everybody's genre, you know, Billy Joel, you can throw in Glass Houses, Bruce Springsteen, The River. I mean, just take a genre and take an artist, and that some of their best albums are in that period. And there was a lot of variety, a lot of different musicians working on it, engineers and producers, a lot of creativity at that period. It seems like the 90s sort of became this period where the record companies thought that they ran the music industry, not the musicians.
One of the things that I don't want to get lost in this conversation is the record label's role. And, you know, every time we start talking about all these big record labels, everybody assumes that they're these big monstrous things. And the reality is that they're not. They're actually, there is no monolithic music industry. The music industry is a lot of different moving parts. And, you know, when somebody's putting up the money, the record label is basically an investment group. They're putting up the money. That's pretty substantial. And I don't want to diminish that value. Inside of the record labels today, yesteryears, the years before, there's always going to be unscrupulous people. And that has been true in the music business since there was a music business. You know, people doing all sorts of dirty things in all sorts of ways, and you've seen it and I've seen it, and it's terrible. But there's also very good people in the music business as well. And so it's always going to be a variety. But yeah, I mean, once really big money started getting involved, there was sort of a power dynamic shift. And that's changed again a little bit because now you don't need $500,000 to break a record. You can break a record off of a promotional budget of maybe $2,000 to $3,000 a month and a startup investment of $10,000 to $30,000 to get the record produced. and you can actually break it that way. I mean, it's hard because we're talking margins at that point. I'm sure there's people watching that and they're like, man, it's like $60,000. Like, what kind of a margin is that? But I mean, comparatively speaking. So I do think that the power dynamic has shifted a little bit more favorably toward the people who are actually making the music. But I don't think that it ever really totally changed from that point where record companies in the 90s were like, I'm going to put $10 million into your record. And everyone was like, $10 million? What the heck are we even supposed to do with that much? You know?
Well, I was making records in that period as both a musician. That was my heyday, the mid-90s. So I remember, I had singles in the charts in England. I came over here, made albums, both a musician and then as an engineer and a producer. I will say that there was many good things and bad things about it. I mean, the reality is the 90s was the heyday of the CD. In fact, if people can look it up on Google, the actual highest point of CD sales was 2003, 2004. That was actually when it peaked. But it peaked and then troughed immediately afterwards. So it was post like 2004 that we really started to see the result of going completely digital and stuff being downloaded and streamed, not really streamed in those days, but downloaded legally or illegally. But anyway, the problem I think for the CD sales is that they were going through the roof, and labels were making so much money that they wanted to control the music industry. So they were signing some stuff that just didn't work. I remember late 90s, early 2000s, when we started seeing a lot of emo bands coming out. And I'm sure there's some good emo bands in this. I'm not going to try and pick on a particular genre. But, Soundgarden was still selling 5 or 6 million records. But these emo bands were getting signed for massive record deals, putting out albums, and they weren't even selling gold. And it was like the labels weren't building off of a groundswell of kids going to see bands. They were deciding, and I remember this vividly because I knew the A&R guys, that they were ahead of the curve. And before it was a natural groundswell, they were going to take a band and like champion it. And the problem is that a lot of those bands did not stick. I worked with a couple of those bands, and I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but I remember they spent an absolute bleeding fortune on them because they believed they knew better than the great American public. Therein, I think, is where the labels definitely got lost because I experienced it. And I did A&R with 2 labels, in the late 90s, early 2000s at that point. And that was the sort of mindset, was like, they so wanted to be first to get into the money that they started not waiting for the natural groundswell. I can't remember who was the manager that used to say, don't sign a band until there's a line out the door. I can't remember, a very famous manager. Answers on the postcard, please. Anybody remembers who that was? And it's just a great line, You go to see the band, there's a line out the door. That's the band you sign. But a lot of these bands were like, no shows, barely any show. One member who was sort of once kind of in a famous band, that was going to be enough. So it's definitely been interesting. That's the part of the music industry that I personally experienced that I think really put a massive nail in its coffin, when it started to think that it knew best. Because all of the bands and all of the artists that we love, all of them come out of left of center. None of them were like plucked from obscurity by some Svengali. The Beatles were signed to a comedy label. They couldn't get signed to a major label. They signed to Parlophone, who'd never put out a rock and roll band ever. They had done comedy albums. And it just so happens that the guy that signed them was their A&R, was also a producer. So that was George Martin was their A&R guy and their producer and a VP of the label. And that's what's so fantastic. Nirvana were on Sub Pop. We all know that all of these bands or these artists that changed the music industry, came from a real groundswell of like, wow, people love this.
Well, I mean, no matter which way you take it, there's always got to be a point where people are getting started or just getting the ball rolling, and they're looking for the right people to work with, and to get the right people to work with is very challenging sometimes. Your options are either to really do your due diligence or get ready to spend a lot of money. And I think that as more people are starting to shift into the independent world, there has to be some kind of a third option, which is be willing to part with a healthy amount of back end, or even just a reasonable amount of back end. And I think that that's going to kind of help neutralize that disparity.
It's just making sure we can get that back end properly paid, that therein lies the
You're not the only person to say that. I had this conversation with an engineer buddy of mine named Andrew Wepper, and that was exactly the first thing he said is that, man, the tough part is getting paid. And, this is why it's also important to not remove the advance or the fee from that. And people will say, well, this is kind of greedy, isn't it? That you're taking an upfront fee and you're also asking for back end. And, I have two responses to that, which is, first of all, a lot of times my upfront fee is not even half of what I've charged record labels before. So let's chill on whether or not I'm being greedy about my upfront fee, And then second of all, if this is really too much for where you're at, I will not be offended if you say this is too expensive for me. Option is always out there. There is no hard feelings about that, because I understand that even at the level that I'm at, which is not super top level guy in terms of my pricing, it's still expensive for a musician to come out of pocket to this degree, because they're starting from a budget of, my personal income. This is where my funds are coming from, my 9 to 5. So it's tough. And I do understand that.
So, Matt, you've been a busy boy. What have you been working on?
Big one that I just finished is the most recent Akon album, which is Ain't No Peace. It's a nice little...
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's a nice little 7-song. You can call it an EP, you can call it an album. I like to call it an album. And I had a very strong hand in it, and now I'm already ball rolling with the pop project, which is turning out to be an endeavor. So,
what's the pop project?
Pop project it's also Akon as well. I don't know what the release.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah. So, I mean, for those who don't know, I work with Akon very regularly. So I do all of his vocal production, recording, and mixing, and occasionally mastering. And so, going into this pop project is like the one that just came out, Ain't No Peace, is a hip hop street album. It's a way where we were able to put the whole thing together in about a month. And it was a lot of work, but it was doable. This is a pop project. Yeah, it was a lot of fun, actually. The pop project, it's a little harder to do that. So there's a lot of stuff being rearranged and changed and new versions being added. And there's a lot more people involved. So, certain publishing releases are not necessarily coming through. So we're replacing guest vocalists and things like that. So it's a whole thing.
That's an amazing association. So Akon hasn't won any Grammys?
Nope. He has not won a single Grammy. Not a one. But that means due. That means it's due. I've never won a Grammy.
Yeah, I've worked on Grammy-nominated material. And that's yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean,
I know lots of people walk that fine line between saying they've won a Grammy, been nominated, or worked on nominated stuff. But no, I've worked on Grammy-nominated material.
Oh, if I've worked on Grammy-winning material, trust me, I'm saying I am a Grammy-winning engineer, 100%. Because there's one engineering Grammy every year, and it's going to the same 10 people. We know who it's going to. You don't have to read the names, so it's okay. Or it's going to people that the people actually recognize, because we remember, Imogen Heap won a Grammy, and this year Phineas won a Grammy. But people don't necessarily hear that also, Rob Kinelski is actually the real engineer on that project, and really he won the Grammy. So a lot of times it's going to people who have like a certain degree of name recognition that engineers don't typically get. So, yeah.
So Phineas didn't engineer the record in the bedroom?
Yes, he did engineer it in the bedroom, where he's probably creating a lot of the special effects and everything like that. And so, I'm not trying to take anything away from his engineering and his creativity, because it's obviously humongous in the record. But the actual hired-on engineer, at least for the mix, because there was no tracking engineer, technically speaking, was Rob Kinelski. And I can tell you because I've listened to those records, and again, no slight to Phineas, but the records would not be what they are were it not for Rob. Like, Phineas got it up to 95%, but that last 5% is where we separate good and great. And I can tell just because I know certain things that engineers do and how they handle it. Having an experienced engineer like Rob made that bit of difference that really took it from really, 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 really good to great. After Bury a Friend kind of popped and became successful, he did not get, from my understanding, a flood of work right away because his name was not being brought up that much. This is the world we're living in. So, it wasn't until he started getting his own press together and people started really pointing him out specifically that the ball started rolling. But that took about a year to start getting that ball rolling. Because also it's very tough to get recognized for credits. Like, credits are really bad these days.
That is an interesting thing, coming back from the days of vinyl and then obviously CDs and even cassettes. At least there was a way to, as small as it could be on a cassette, but at least there was a way to actually find out who produced, engineered, or mixed a track. Now you're correct, yeah. It's pretty hard to find out who actually worked on the record you liked. What are you working on now? What's coming up? What's in the near future?
Well, following that line, I've sort of been looking at my whole career from an outside point of view. One of the things that's been great with COVID is that I've sort of been able to take a step back from everything and just look at everything and say, okay, where does my career need to go? So I can't give you too many details because I've signed an NDA, but I can say that there is a 90% chance of a studio build that will be occurring that I will be heavily involved in. So hopefully in the upcoming future, I will be a operator of a full-fledged studio. So I've been looking at that, been doing a little bit of research as far as that goes. I've also been looking at myself in terms of being, I've always looked at myself as being an engineer, then an educator, and then whatever else I am. But then all that whatever else started coming to the front. So I started thinking like, well, I'm also a community voice. So I've been going down to, over the last 7 months, I've been going down to San Diego and corresponding with some politicians that signed in a law that affected the engineering and production community very heavily. And it took 6 months of back and forth, but I was able to get that law exempted for us. So I want to continue that vibe. I want to keep moving with those sort of, what can I do for my community? There was a law that was passed in technically 2019, but came into effect 2020 called California Bill AB 5. And it was meant to specifically kind of target the Uber, Lyft, rideshare, Instacart, DoorDash, people who were being classified as freelancers, but kind of acting as employees, although in a gray area. And the law redefined what it meant to be a freelancer. And it changed a few crucial things from the previous mechanism. The main one being that the new law assumes that everybody by default is an employee, and it's on the burden of the hiring body to prove that they are in fact a freelancer, which right from the gate is a huge disincentivizer for anybody outside of California to hire anyone in California, which that's problems for people in the music world. In addition to that, the law is very, very broad. It states that anybody who's being hired and performing something that's in the regular practice of the hiring entity is not a freelancer. Well, every time I get hired by a music label to work on music, that is absolutely well within the practice of the hiring entity. If you're a touring band and you're hiring musicians to play on your tour, then that is well within the scope of part of the regular hiring practice. So for everybody in the music community, music production, songwriters, everything, it completely changed the landscape of, are you a freelancer or not? And here's the thing, there are certain conditions where it is beneficial and right for somebody to be an employee. I'm not going to comment on the Uber and Lyft type of thing. That's not my specialty. I'll let those guys all work that out. But under some conditions, it might be better to be an employee and it might make more sense. But for people in the music production world, we don't have a problem with not being hired under the correct regulations. Nobody's working for less than minimum wage, right? You can't get a session player, even an entry-level session player, to walk in the door for less than $75 an hour. And most of them will not show up for anything less than $100 to $150. And that's talking about like entry level. So getting paid is not the problem that we face in the music community. The other problems are like getting enough gigs. That's where we tend to struggle, things like that. Or being, when we are being paid in the way that they're supposed to. So we don't need to change the way we're supposed to be paid. People need to be held accountable. So this law, I started getting like all these calls and emails from people saying like, yo, my music library publisher is telling me that they're not going to hire me for this next library all of a sudden because of this AB5 law. Like, what the heck am I supposed to do? How do I get around this? So I did a lot of research on the law. I was like, okay, well, here's the ways that you can try and get around with this, but you're really ultimately going to have to convince the people hiring you that it's going to be okay. And they might not want to take that risk. So I went down to San Diego. I met with the author of the bill. I explained what the situation really was and who I was in the music community. We went back and forth. I talked to a lawyer at one point to help me draft language in a way that was like, not going to undermine the language that they had already put into the bill, but would actually ultimately kind of exempt us. And then finally, after 6 months of this, they finally said, you know what? The best way to do this is just to exempt the following professions. And it's everybody in the music production community. And I said, I think that you're right. And I really appreciate you, listening, hearing me out, and being responsive to this. And it's a good look.
So when did that happen? When does it come into effect?
It has to be passed as California AB 1850, but you can read the text of 1850 and you'll see it blue highlighted for how it amends AB 5. And there's a whole long list of the following professions are exempted and now work under the Borello ruling, which was the previous ruling. And it'll say songwriters, recording artists, music producers. You'll see it specifically says mix engineers.
Yeah. And what about recording engineers?
Recording engineers. And basically everything that I was directly connected to. And so it does have to pass, but I think that it will. And that should go into effect 2021. I think that there are times where it is appropriate to employ people. I think that, if you are an in-house engineer for a company that is a recording studio, I think it makes sense to employ. I think if you're doing a tour and you're going to be away for 6 months touring, and that's your players are with you that entire 6 months, then I think putting them on W-2s and making sure that they have unemployment insurance covered and things like that, and also doing the tax shares with payroll, that all makes sense. But the fact is most of the time we're already doing that.
Yeah, it was interesting because I know the law, and I'm really glad you got to explain in detail what you did, which is absolutely fantastic. But I do remember everybody going, this was supposed to be to protect Uber and Lyft employees, and now it's blanketly, changing the whole way that we do business. It's always been a tough one because when you're hiring musicians, you want to do it through the musicians union when there's a label present because they get health benefits and all this kind of stuff. But it's very difficult when you're doing independent projects to pay them through the musicians union because, if you do it to the letter of it, could be half your budget goes on 4 guys for 4 hours. It's you've got to play single scale, double scale for the band leader. All of this sounds great until you start doing 2 to 3 to 4 songs, and suddenly you're paying $2,000 plus each musician, which is absolutely fantastic from a musician's perspective, but makes it impossible to do that with an independent project.
It's not fantastic if I say, okay, then I'm just going to hire the band from Texas.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the problem. So, it's important that everybody gets paid fairly. But the fact is that you can't legislate the budget into existing. So if I'm doing an independent project and somebody comes to me and they say, I've got 15 grand to do my album, then I have to say, okay, well, what's really doable on this? And maybe there's a couple records where I'm going to want to hire musicians, but I'm not going to be able to go through and W-2 them and all that kind of stuff. And even if I am, it's not going to change their end pay. It just means it's going to come out of their end pay. So it's like, what do you want? Do you want $150 in cash to come in and do an hour of work? Or do you want me to do it with a W-2 and then you get paid $100 plus the health insurance, plus the unemployment insurance and all the other stuff. And you avoid your half of the payroll tax and all that kind of stuff. It's going to end up being the same. because nobody's paying minimum wage. No one's showing up to a gig where it's like, well, I'm making minimum wage, so I guess it's legal because I've got health insurance.
Like all these things, the best thing is always common sense. But unfortunately, common sense doesn't always prevail.
Common sense doesn't always exist. Common sense is a bit of a myth, and that's one of the things is that the people who are politicians are not in the music business. So it is the responsibility of somebody, at least, to go down and say, hey, this is how the music business works. So I just ended up taking it upon myself because if somebody else had done it before the law had initially passed, then I wouldn't have needed to. But obviously nobody else was really doing it.
It's a good and a bad, isn't it? Because it's going to shake up businesses that are taking advantage of people. But then in a freelancer world, like you're explaining, was stopping people from getting gigs. So, or forcing them to be creative and working around it, which is always an uncomfortable situation. You want to try and be as legal as possible. You are wearing a Soul Veggies t-shirt.
I am wearing a Soul Veggies t-shirt. This is a band I produced a long time ago. And yet you haven't officially produced the band if you don't wear the t-shirt.
I always buy the album of the band that I worked on. Like, first day it comes out, I buy it. It's like a super edition. Have to buy it. Sometimes when you can, it's a physical copy.
What's that?
Yeah, exactly. I still love records of the very late 70s through to like the mid 80s. I feel like every genre at that period seemed to nail it. And I love that sort of, that mid-early 90s kind of Portishead, Massive Attack stuff still sounds super fresh to me. Still don't think it's been beaten. Tricky's first solo record, amazing. Maxima K, or however you pronounce it.
Man, those are great references. I got to go back to those records because the space design in those was really like, it has a place no matter what era we're in. 30 years from now, it'll still be a great reference.
And they're grit. They got grit to them because they're all like, you know, they're not necessarily 8-bit. A lot of them were 16-bit samplers, but they just had a grit to them. They weren't being done in DAWs. They were being done to tapes. So they were looping it till it felt good. They were taking an area and looping it. So there has a little wrongness in there. It's interesting how technology controls more about our music than anything else.
Well, I think ideally we should be getting to the point now where we have to become masters of the technology. I think it's a weird thing about music today, though, which is that it's now the people who are the most technically expertised at using these tools that are making the music, as opposed to people who are the most sophisticated with actually playing instruments. This is a little weird, but it really is that kind of a case. Like, if you can really use Fruity Loops, you will kill the game right now. Pop, hip hop, even a lot of rock and roll is really intersecting with this kind of stuff.
I agree with you, because one of the conversations I have when I'm working with like solo artists, and they've been around working with lots of different producers and writers, and then they come to me and they play me their stuff, and they're not happy with what's going on. And a lot of the conversations when I work with singers, especially for girl singers, where they're working with a younger guy who's maybe they feel a little belittled by, like, oh, you know, this guy told me this or this guy told me that. And I have to kind of dissect it a bit for them. And I realize that most of the time they're working with somebody who's maybe creative and talented, but still very, very fresh to the tools. So they have one way of working. So when the singer's trying to push in different directions and try different things outside of the time it and tune it kind of idea that they know how to do, that's where the tension arrives. Or then you get the opposite thing where instead of a producer trying to control the singer to sing exactly on it, they haven't got the experience yet, that they just make the singer sing 50 times and then no direction. I do remember working with David Foster. I think was the biggest validation I've ever had. He said, I've never done more than 10 takes of any singer in my life. And he's like, it's one of two things. It's like, yes, I get to work with great singers. I mean, David obviously works with like Celine Dion and Barbra Streisand and these incredible singers. He said, yes, that's a big part of it, working with a great singer. And he's like, but the other thing is, he goes, I pride myself on actually knowing when something's wrong so I can fix it. And do I really need 10 attempts to get that word right? And he's right. If you've got an ear and you know where to go, you pinpoint it. Instead of just like, do it again, do it again, do it again, do it again, do it again. You go, that's really good. I just need the end of the phrase. Can you just watch what you're doing there? You know, giving really good direction. And he was right. We didn't do more than 10 takes. The vocal's fantastic.
I would say that for anybody who's aspiring to be a vocal producer, start with being a vocal editor. and
Right.
go in and make it be like, my job is to time and tune vocals. And as you start dissecting those vocals, you start learning so much, because I used to be in that world where I didn't necessarily, I knew it wouldn't sound right, but I wouldn't have the vocabulary or the understanding. This is when I was primarily a tracking engineer. I wasn't really a vocal producer, and I wasn't really espousing to be one. But a lot of times people come in without a vocal producer. So I would know if it was wrong. I just wouldn't necessarily be able to say how it was wrong. And now, because I've been working so closely, particularly with Con, where I can hear what's really happening and hear the minutia, and we go over like the very small things, I've learned so much about vocal production where, I don't like playlists, period. I think that playlists kill the magic of the moment, because by the time you go back and you listen, you're listening for different things. And if take is right in the moment because you hear it in the moment and it feels right. And if you don't get it, you erase it and you go back and you retake it. And maybe psychologically, some singers like to have a safety take, but we all know that safety take is just in case they do something completely uninhibited that happens to be totally left field and unexpected, and something fantastic happens. Otherwise, it's just useless take. We get it right, and I don't want to have to deal with, if I've got more than like 2 playlists, I'm just hating life.
Well, I mean, I've been blessed to work with singers that you would love for that. And I've mentioned this many times for people they can glaze over, but Steven Tyler self-comps. It's 40 minutes of actual focus. So he'll sing and he'll be like, "Zabba-doo-ba-zabba-da, stop. Okay, I need to punch in that word. And then he'll just keep singing. And then, 2/3 way through the verse, he's like, play that last line back. Play the last line back. Don't like those 2 words. Let me punch him in. And then he punch in those 2 words. Then he keeps singing. And it was just brilliant. But at that point, it was 40 years of experience of making albums.
That experience can translate onto you, because as you watch him do that, you say, oh, I get now I see why we're redoing that one. And then you kind of become tuned into some of those things that can happen, things that maybe you didn't even notice until, I have this experience with Con a lot, where I don't necessarily hear something as being off, and he'll be like, no, wait, let me get this again. He'll do it the way he really meant to do it. And I'll be like, wow, okay, yes, that is better. And now I understand why, because I've heard that comparison immediately.
A couple of great discussions here. I think also when it comes to vocal comping, it can be like putting a pickaxe to your eye. But the reality is if once you get in a zone, it's a beautiful thing. Like if I'm comping a vocal and I've got that 5 to 10 takes that I'm sifting through, sometimes I've got 3, but it's usually about 5 to 10 maximum. I'm going through it. If I get in a zone and I love the expression in an artist's voice, I start feeling it, and before you know it, that comp becomes quite easy. It's usually like half an hour to get my brain into it. And there's nothing worse than when the phone going off or somebody walking in and you've got to get back to the zone. I like to have really, really good notes when I'm tracking. Star things I absolutely love as they go down.
Yeah.
I trust that when I come to comp, because once you're out of the vocal, it's really hard to remember how to get back into it. So I trust those, and I listen, and I go to that take and go, oh yeah, I see why I like that. And I put it up and I start building it like this. And before you know it, I'm in a zone. But also doing that as you're writing, doing that on your lyric sheet means that you can be exactly like, David Foster, who's 2nd or 3rd most successful producer in the world.
When you're doing the comps, by the way, do you find that you'll find a magic take where like 80% of everything you need is in the one take, and then maybe there'll just be like a couple places where you're like, no, that one's got to be off? And we need
not always, but it is magic when you get that. And that's why taking good notes going down, I always trust that process. I think for those of you watching, if you make good notes as they go down, don't give yourself homework afterwards. Personally, I don't know about you, Matt, I hated doing homework. My son, who's 13, seems to love doing homework. Well, he's going to say he doesn't love it, but he seems to actually do it. Me, I would do anything in my life not to have to do any homework.
I've always been the type of person where if my heart is in something, I am doing that. And if my heart is not in that, I am doing anything else. So I used to get detention a lot when I was in school, because that was the only way I could get my homework done. Otherwise, I just couldn't. Unless it was something I was really interested in which case then I would bring in the most spectacular homework you'd ever seen in your life. So many music producers that I know have thought that they were going to become architects. It's amazing. There's either a love of architecture or the actual desire to be an architect, and then I feel like those two fields are somehow super magically related.
Well, my friend, this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah,
we got a lot of editing to do. We got loads of conversation. Eric's going to have a lot of fun on this one.
I'm really intrigued to see if there's like half an hour of actual music talk. There is for sure.
Yeah, we did at least that.
You have to archive the rest of it, and then like 20 years later, you release the lost tapes. Produce like a pro the lost tapes.
Yeah, for my kids to hear, like, see, your old dad wasn't that square back in those days.
Yeah, when they're 20 years old, I'm sure they can hear about all of the ridiculousness that you've been involved in, because I'm sure it's got to at least rival mine.
I cannot confirm nor deny that I may have been involved in some silliness.
Smart man, right there.
Yes, especially not at the moment. All right, Matt, thank you ever so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. I'll catch you next time we do a video together.
I'm sure it'll be sooner rather than later. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks, everyone. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing. Please leave any comments and questions below. I'll try to twist Matt's arm to actually answer them. Silence. I think he's going to.
Oh, no, I'm here. Of course, I will answer questions. I thought that was a sign off.
There you go. He said, of course.